Welcome. If you crave chilling true crime stories, real mysteries, and twists you'll never see coming, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and join a community that never looks away from the truth. Because every week, we shine a light where others won't. Are you ready? Let's begin. It started like every small-town tragedy, with a missing child no one thought would stay missing. On a crisp autumn evening in 1995, 10-year-old Ethan Miller vanished from his quiet suburban street in the town of Oak Ridge. His red bicycle was found lying on its side under a flickering street lamp, the front wheel spinning like a clock counting down. No one heard a scream. No one saw a car. He was just gone. The police launched a full-scale search. Neighbors scoured the woods, and for a while, the entire town pulsed with fear. But weeks turned into months, and Ethan's disappearance became just another unsolved case. Years passed. People moved on. But the Miller family never recovered. His mother, Anna, became reclusive. His father started drinking. And their once cheerful house became a haunting reminder of a boy who vanished into thin air. Then, almost exactly 20 years later, another child disappeared. This time, it was a girl. And this time, Oak Ridge couldn't pretend it was safe anymore. Oak Ridge wasn't the sort of place people locked their doors. Not really. It was one of those towns where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where every neighbor knew your name, and where the loudest thing you heard at night was the wind rattling through the trees. But tragedies, no matter how severe, fade over time. By the early 2000s, Ethan's name had become a story parents whispered to scare their kids into staying close to home. Don't wander off, or you'll end up like Ethan Miller, they'd say, a grim cautionary tale wrapped in suburban safety. The posters were taken down, the TV interviews stopped, and Ethan's face, once printed in grainy black and white on every telephone pole, was replaced by garage sale flyers and lost pet signs. Oak Ridge healed itself by pretending. Anna Miller never played along with that narrative. She still left Ethan's bedroom untouched. His baseball cap, his action figures, his school books, everything sat exactly as it had on that October evening in 1995. She cleaned the room weekly, vacuuming the floor, dusting the shelves, keeping his memory alive in a space no one else dared enter. Her husband, Mark, grieved in his own way, which was to drink until the edges of memory blurred and the pain dulled. He took a second job as a night security guard, working shifts that kept him away from the house, away from the silence, away from Anna's unending hope. For years, the Miller family was a ghost in Oak Ridge. The cheerful suburban home with its bright blue shutters became something else entirely, a warning sign on their quiet cul-de-sac. Kids would ride their bikes past, pointing at the drawn curtains, daring each other to walk up the front steps. But for all the whispers, all the speculation, Ethan's disappearance became a story people could live with. It had been 20 years. Surely, he was gone. And then, on a similar crisp October evening in 2015, Oak Ridge's fragile illusion of safety shattered. Her name was Sarah Whitman, 11 years old, blonde hair, freckled cheeks, and a laugh that carried across the playground. Sarah lived 3 blocks away from where Ethan had disappeared 2 decades prior, and just like Ethan, she had been riding her bike home. It was a Friday night, one of those chilly evenings where the air feels charged with the promise of Halloween. The Whitman family had been planning a weekend trip to the pumpkin patch. Sarah had begged her mom to let her stay out just 15 more minutes to ride around with her friends. 15 minutes. That was all it took. When Sarah's father realized she wasn't home for dinner, he assumed she'd lost track of time. He called her friends. None of them had seen her since she pedaled off, waving goodbye at the end of Oakwood Drive. By the time the police were called, Sarah's bicycle had been found lying in the same eerily familiar way as Ethan's, on its side, under a broken street lamp, one wheel slowly spinning in the breeze. The entire town froze. In an instant, every memory of Ethan's disappearance came rushing back, every fear that had been buried under years of suburban routine clawing its way to the surface. Parents began calling their children home. Porch lights flicked on across Oak Ridge, and for the first time in 20 years, people locked their doors. The Oak Ridge Police Department was overwhelmed. It wasn't a big town, and major crimes were rare. In fact, most of the officers who had investigated Ethan's disappearance were long retired, their files gathering dust in evidence lockers. But Sarah's case changed everything. Detective Laura Bennett was assigned to lead the investigation. A woman in her mid-30s with sharp instincts and an obsession with details, Laura had grown up in Oak Ridge. She remembered Ethan. She remembered the fear. She also remembered the frustration of a case that had gone cold despite exhaustive searches. Within hours, the police established a command center. Search teams were deployed, K-9 units combed the woods, and helicopters with spotlights circled overhead. Neighbors volunteered to help, but there was an undercurrent of dread. They weren't just searching for a missing girl. They were searching for a ghost, an echo of a tragedy that had haunted their town for 2 decades. As the hours passed with no leads, Laura found herself drawn to the old files. She sat in the evidence room, poring over faded photos and yellowed reports from 1995. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Ethan and Sarah had disappeared from nearly the same spot. Both bikes had been abandoned under broken street lamps. No witnesses, no sound, just silence. The question Laura couldn't shake was this: if the same person was responsible, what had they been doing for 20 years? The renewed investigation brought reporters back to Oak Ridge. They were eager to revisit the unsolved mystery of Ethan Miller, and for the first time in years, Anna agreed to an interview. She sat on her living room couch, framed by family photos that hadn't changed in decades. Her voice was calm but haunted. "When Ethan disappeared, I thought the world would stop," she said softly. "I thought people would search every day until we found him. But the days turned into weeks, and then months, and eventually, people moved on. Everyone but us." The reporter asked her what she thought happened to Sarah. Anna's eyes hardened. "I think the same thing that happened to Ethan. And I think whoever took him never left." It was a chilling statement, and it made headlines the next day. Oak Ridge mother, MY son's kidnapper, is still here. The town erupted with rumors. Some were convinced a serial predator had been living among them for years, hiding in plain sight. Others speculated about cult activity, pointing to the eerie similarities between the 2 disappearances. Conspiracy forums lit up with theories, some claiming Oak Ridge was cursed, others convinced it was a cover-up. But for the Whitman family, there was no time for speculation. They plastered Sarah's face on every telephone pole, every gas station window, every school bulletin board. "Please bring her home," Sarah's mother begged through tears during a televised press conference. "We just want our daughter back." Halloween came and went without celebration. Parents kept their children inside, streets that were once filled with laughter now silent. Police patrolled constantly, their flashing lights a constant reminder that something evil lingered in Oak Ridge. The woods were searched again and again, every shed and abandoned building inspected. But no sign of Sarah was found. Weeks passed, then months. And just like before, the search slowed. The news coverage faded. Life in Oak Ridge resumed its quiet rhythm. But this time, people didn't forget so easily. Every time a car drove slowly down a street, curtains twitched. Every time a stranger walked through town, whispers followed. And every time a parent tucked their child into bed, they double-checked the locks. Something was wrong in Oak Ridge. Everyone felt it. No one could prove it. Detective Bennett wasn't ready to let the case go cold. The similarities between the disappearances gnawed at her. She spent nights at her desk, cross-referencing old reports, interviewing retired officers, digging through evidence that hadn't been touched in 2 decades. That's when she noticed something strange. In both cases, neighbors had reported seeing a man in a dark coat near the street lamp where the bicycles were found. In 1995, the description was dismissed as too vague. In 2015, it was barely noted, but the detail stuck with her. She started building a timeline, tracing who lived near that street in both years. That's when she found him, a man named Daniel Cross. He'd been living in Oak Ridge since the early 90s. Worked odd jobs, kept to himself, never married, no criminal record. But there was something about him, something unsettling. When Bennett interviewed him, he was polite, calm, almost too calm. He claimed he barely remembered Ethan's disappearance. Said he didn't watch the news much. Said he'd been home alone the night Sarah vanished. No witnesses could confirm his alibi. And while there was nothing concrete tying him to the disappearances, something about his demeanor lingered in Bennett's mind. Daniel Cross lived in a small, run-down house at the edge of Oak Ridge, near the woods. The yard was overgrown, the paint on the shutters peeling. People said he'd been living there alone for over 20 years. No one visited. No one knew much about him. Bennett drove by one night, parking down the street. The house was dark, except for a dim light flickering in the basement window. She sat in her car, watching, waiting, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. But without evidence, there was nothing she could do. By the following spring, Sarah's case was officially declared cold. The news crews left, and Oak Ridge settled back into an uneasy quiet. But for Anna Miller and the Whitman family, life would never return to normal. And for Detective Bennett, the feeling of unfinished business gnawed at her every day. 2 children, 2 bikes, 2 street lamps, 20 years apart. It wasn't coincidence. She knew that much, and she was determined to prove it. What none of them knew was that the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lila Jennings was 11, walking home from a friend's birthday party when she disappeared on the same stretch of road where Ethan's bike was found decades earlier. The similarities were too perfect to ignore. No witnesses, no noise, and the same eerie flickering street lamp. Detective Daniel Carter, a local cop who'd grown up in Oak Ridge, was assigned the case. Daniel had been Ethan's classmate all those years ago. The case wasn't just professional, it was personal. As Carter dug deeper, he noticed unsettling patterns. Both children's parents had received a single and signed handwritten letter in their mailboxes days before the disappearances. Both letters contained only 4 chilling words. "Do you remember me?" The media latched onto the story, dubbing the unknown predator the Oak Ridge Phantom. Parents stopped letting their kids out after dark. But something about this case was different. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the second kidnapping wasn't random. Whoever took Lila wasn't just repeating history, they were reliving it. Daniel Carter sat in his dimly lit office at Oak Ridge PD, the 2 letters side by side on his desk. Both were written in shaky, looping script on plain stationery. No smudges, no fingerprints, no postage stamps. Whoever left them had done so by hand, quietly, carefully. The first letter, Anna Miller's, was creased and worn, evidence of the many times she'd held it over the years. She'd kept it in a shoebox under Ethan's bed, unable to throw it away. The second, found in the Jennings mailbox, was identical. The same handwriting, the same 4 words. "Do you remember me?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the words until they seemed to blur. They weren't taunts. They weren't demands. They were intimate, almost like a plea. But from who? And why send them to the parents, not the children? Daniel hadn't spoken Ethan's name in years, not out loud. He'd been 10 years old when Ethan disappeared, and the memory was seared into his mind like a scar. He remembered riding bikes with him after school, trading baseball cards, sneaking candy into the movie theater. Ethan was his best friend. He also remembered the day Ethan vanished. The endless questions from police. The way teachers pulled him aside in hushed tones. The way his mother started walking him to school every day, clutching his hand so tightly it left marks. Daniel had joined the police force, in part, because of Ethan. He'd wanted to bring justice to kids like him. But Oak Ridge wasn't a city where big cases happened. For years, his job was traffic stops, noise complaints, the occasional burglary. And now, here he was, staring at evidence from a case that felt like it had been waiting for him. Daniel drove out to the Jennings house the next morning. The small Cape Cod home was surrounded by yellow police tape, reporters clustered at the end of the driveway. He flashed his badge and ducked under the tape. Inside, the house was silent except for the muffled sobs of Lila's mother, Karen. She sat on the couch, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her husband, Tom, stood stiffly behind her, arms crossed, jaw tight. Daniel introduced himself softly. "I'm Detective Carter. I'm leading the investigation." Karen looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Please find her." "We will," Daniel said. He wanted to sound confident, but his voice wavered. Tom gestured toward the kitchen table. "The letter's over there." Daniel picked up a clear evidence bag. Inside was the folded note, the same handwriting he'd seen on Anna Miller's letter. Did anyone unusual come by in the last week? Any packages, deliveries, strangers? Tom shook his head. "Nothing. We didn't even notice the letter until after she disappeared. I thought it was a prank." Karen let out a soft sob. "Why us? Why her?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know. Later that night, Daniel drove to the scene of Lila's disappearance. The road was empty, a single street lamp flickering like a heartbeat. He stood where her bicycle had been found, the cool autumn air biting at his face. It was eerily quiet. Even the crickets seemed to avoid this stretch of road. Daniel crouched, shining his flashlight over the ground. The grass was bent in a few places, as if someone had knelt there. No tire tracks, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. He straightened and looked up at the street lamp. The light buzzed, flickered, and then steadied, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, imagining Ethan's red bike lying here 20 years ago. Same road, same eerie glow. Whoever had done this knew this spot well. Too well. Daniel was back in his car when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Detective Carter, a woman's voice said softly. Yes, this is Anna Miller. Daniel sat up straight. He hadn't expected her to call. I heard about the girl, Anna said. Lila. Yes, ma'am. I need to show you something. Of course. I can come by tomorrow. No, tonight. There was a pause, a tremor in her voice. Because I think he's back. Anna's house looked the same as it had 20 years ago. The blue shutters were faded now, the lawn overgrown, but the porch light was still on, just as it had been the night Ethan vanished. She met Daniel at the door, her face pale and drawn. She led him inside without a word. The living room was dim, smelling faintly of lavender and dust. Anna guided him upstairs to a small bedroom. Daniel froze. The room was a time capsule. Posters of baseball players from the 90s still lined the walls. A stack of Goosebumps books sat on the nightstand. The bed was neatly made, a stuffed dinosaur propped against the pillow. Ethan's room, Anna whispered. She crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, pulling out a shoebox. Inside were newspaper clippings, old flyers, and the letter. But there was something else, something Daniel hadn't seen before. A Polaroid. It was of Ethan, but not the Ethan Daniel remembered. This Ethan was older, maybe 12 or 13. He was standing in front of a chain-link fence, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as if he'd been caught off guard. Daniel's breath caught. Where did you get this? Anna's hands trembled. It was in my mailbox. Last year. Last year. I didn't show anyone. I thought it was a cruel joke. But now another child is gone. Daniel stared at the photo. If it was real, it meant Ethan had been alive long after the police had given up searching, which meant there was a chance Lila still was, too. News of the Polaroid leaked, and the town descended into chaos. The story made national headlines. Photo suggests boy missing for 20 years was alive years after disappearance. Suddenly, Oak Ridge wasn't just a quiet town with a tragedy. It was the hunting ground of a predator who'd been operating under their noses for decades. The press dubbed him the Oak Ridge Phantom, a name that stuck like glue. Talk shows debated theories. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Paranormal blogs even speculated about supernatural involvement, given the eerie timing and identical details of the kidnappings. Parents pulled their children from school. Businesses closed early. Oak Ridge felt like a town under siege. Daniel covered his office wall in photographs and notes, connecting strings between victims, locations, and dates. 2 disappearances he knew of. 2 letters. 2 bikes. But what if there were more? Daniel started digging through missing person reports across the state, focusing on kids who vanished without a trace, kids who fit a similar pattern. He found 4. For children over the past 25 years, all within a 2-hour drive of Oak Ridge. Each case had gone cold. Each child had been last seen near a wooded area or a dimly lit road. The more he mapped it out, the clearer it became. The Phantom didn't just haunt Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was his home base, his hunting ground. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel became consumed by the case. His desk was buried under files, his walls covered in photographs and notes. He slept in his office more than his apartment. His colleagues whispered about him, worried he was losing himself. But Daniel didn't care. He couldn't let another kid vanish into nothingness. Not like Ethan, not like Lila. It came on a cold December morning. A mail carrier found it first, sitting in the mailbox at the Jennings house. Another envelope, unmarked. Inside, a single piece of paper. For words, written in that same looping script. She remembers me now. The letter sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge. People whispered in grocery stores. Parents clutched their kids' hands tighter. And Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since he was 10 years old. Fear. Not just fear for Lila, but fear that the Phantom was playing with him, mocking him. Daniel stared at the letter for hours, reading those words over and over. She remembers me now. What did it mean? Did Lila know her abductor? Was she alive? Or was this a confession? One lead kept gnawing at Daniel. Daniel Cross. the recluse who'd lived on the edge of town for decades. Daniel drove past his house again late one night. The same flickering basement light glowed faintly. He parked down the street and approached on foot, moving silently through the overgrown yard. Through the dirty window, he saw something strange. A wall lined with photographs. He squinted, heart pounding. The photos were of children, smiling school portraits, candid snapshots, and in the center, a Polaroid of Ethan. Daniel's breath caught. He snapped a photo of the window with his phone and hurried back to his car. He needed a warrant. 2 days later, Daniel returned with backup. Officers swarmed the property, breaking down the door. The house smelled of mildew and decay. The living room was empty, but the walls were covered in newspaper clippings about missing children. They found the basement door locked from the outside. Daniel kicked it open. What he saw made his blood run cold. The basement was filled with old toys, clothes, and photographs. Each item was carefully labeled with a name and a date. In the center of the room was an old rocking chair, and on the chair sat a single stuffed rabbit. Lila's. Daniel's breath, he turned back to the boy. "Ethan," he said again, trying to keep his tone calm. "I'm Daniel Carter. Do you remember me?" The boy's wide, haunted eyes flicked up at him. Daniel felt a jolt of recognition. He knew those eyes. They were Ethan's eyes, older but unmistakable. The same boy he'd ridden bikes with. The same boy who'd vanished without a trace 20 years ago. The boy's lips trembled. You got big," he whispered. Daniel's throat tightened. "So did you." The sound of sirens grew louder outside as officers swarmed the crumbling property. Daniel stayed with the kids, flashlight trained on the stairs as he waited for backup. The house creaked and groaned like it was alive, every gust of wind rattling loose window panes. The basement smelled of mold and something darker, something rotten that clung to the back of his throat. The shrine upstairs made more sense now. The Polaroids weren't trophies. They were a twisted collection, a timeline of every child this monster had taken. Daniel's mind raced. How long had Ethan been down here? 2 decades? How many other kids had lived and died in this basement? He scanned the room again, his stomach lurching at the sight of tiny details. A row of small shoes lined neatly under a shelf. A child's blanket, threadbare and faded, folded with care. A wooden rocking horse, splintered with age, sitting in the corner like a sentinel. This wasn't just a prison. It was a playroom. And whoever had built it wasn't just a kidnapper. They were a predator who had constructed their own twisted world. The door at the top of the stairs burst open, and 2 officers stormed down, weapons drawn. Daniel stepped aside as they took in the scene, their faces hardening. "Get these chains off," Daniel barked. One officer knelt with a set of bolt cutters, snapping the lock on Lila's chain. She flinched at the sound, then threw her arms around Daniel's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. "You're safe," he murmured, holding her tightly for a moment before gently passing her to a paramedic who had come down the stairs. Then he turned to Ethan. The boy recoiled as the officer approached with the bolt cutters, curling tighter against the wall. "Ethan, it's okay," Daniel said softly. He crouched down, meeting the boy's wide, terrified eyes. "We're here to help. I promise." After a tense moment, Ethan hesitantly extended his leg, allowing the officer to cut through the chain. When the lock fell away, Ethan didn't move. He stayed curled in the corner, trembling. Daniel reached out a hand. "Come on, let's get you out of here." Ethan stared at him for a long moment before finally slipping his small, cold hand into Daniel's. By the time they emerged from the house, the scene outside was chaos. Red and blue lights painted the night sky as news crews, neighbors, and first responders swarmed the property. Lila was rushed into an ambulance, her mother's screams of relief echoing through the cold night air. Ethan followed slowly, clinging to Daniel's hand, his bare feet shuffling on the cracked driveway. The crowd fell silent as they saw him. Some gasped, others whispered, because everyone in Oak Ridge knew his face. It was Ethan Miller, the boy who had vanished 20 years ago, alive. But amidst the shock and celebration, one chilling realization hung heavy over Daniel. The house was empty. Whoever had built this dungeon, whoever had taken Ethan and Lila, wasn't there. Daniel's stomach twisted as he scanned the crowd, half expecting to see the phantom standing among them, watching. He pulled aside an officer. "Search the property. Every inch. Crawl spaces, attic, sheds, everything. He's out there." But even as he barked the order, he knew it was too late. The phantom had vanished into the night. At Oak Ridge General Hospital, doctors and nurses worked frantically to assess Ethan and Lila. Lila clung to her mother, sobbing and trembling, while Ethan remained eerily calm. Too calm. Daniel watched from outside the glass window of Ethan's hospital room. The boy sat on the bed, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the wall. He hadn't asked for food, water, or comfort. He hadn't cried, and he hadn't spoken a word since whispering his name. Daniel finally stepped inside. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. Ethan slowly turned his head. His eyes were hollow, like he was staring straight through Daniel. "Do you remember me?" Daniel asked, repeating the words from the letter. Ethan's lips parted, and for the first time, his voice was clear. "Yes," he said softly. Daniel's chest tightened. "Can you tell me where he is?" "The man who took you." Ethan's gaze shifted to the window, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's here." Daniel spun toward the glass, heart pounding. Nurses bustled in the hallway. Officers stood guard by the entrance. No one suspicious. "Where?" Daniel asked. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the corner of the room. "He's always here." Daniel followed his gaze. The corner was empty, but his stomach knotted with unease. An officer rushed into the room, holding an evidence bag. "Detective, we found this taped to your car." Inside the bag was a folded piece of paper. Daniel's blood ran cold as he recognized the looping handwriting. He unfolded it slowly. "Welcome back, Ethan." "You too, Daniel." That night, Daniel gathered his team in the Oak Ridge PD briefing room. Photographs of Ethan and Lila were pinned to a corkboard alongside crime scene images of the house. "This isn't over," Daniel said, his voice steady but low. "We've confirmed Ethan Miller has been alive this entire time. That means this guy isn't just a killer. He's a collector. He keeps them." Detective Laura Bennett, who had led Sarah Whitman's case, frowned. But Sarah wasn't there. If he's keeping kids, why wasn't she with them? Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's what scares me." A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel pointed to the photographs of the shrine. "He's been watching us for years. He knew Ethan. He knew me. And he knows we're getting close." He held up the note. "This is personal. He's not going to stop." It took days before Ethan began to talk. At first, it was small details. The sound of the man's boots on the stairs, the way he always whistled the same eerie tune, the smell of tobacco and sawdust that clung to his clothes. But when Daniel asked for a name, Ethan shook his head. "He doesn't have one," Ethan said softly. "Not to us." "What do you call him?" Daniel asked. Ethan's voice trembled. "Daddy." Daniel's stomach turned. "Did he tell you that was his name?" Ethan nodded. "He said he was everyone's daddy. He said no one else wanted us." Daniel clenched his fists under the table, struggling to keep his composure. "Ethan, I need you to think really hard. Did he ever leave the house? Did you ever hear where he went?" Ethan tilted his head, thinking. "Sometimes he went out at night. He said he was finding more brothers and sisters." The news that the Oak Ridge Phantom was still at large sent the town into a frenzy. Schools closed indefinitely. Parents formed armed neighborhood watch groups. Stores sold out of locks, security cameras, and floodlights. But fear wasn't the Phantom's only weapon. He had humiliated the police. He had taken 2 children in broad daylight. And now he had let one of them go alive. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a game. And he was the opponent. A week later, Oak Ridge PD received an anonymous tip about an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the woods outside town. Daniel and his team hiked through the forest, weapons drawn, until they reached the decrepit structure. Inside, they found another shrine. This one was different. Instead of toys and photos, the walls were covered in drawings. Childlike scrawls of stick figures, houses, and a tall, faceless man. Some drawings had red scribbles for eyes. Others showed a boy behind bars. On a table in the center of the room was a single Polaroid. It was of Sarah Whitman. She was alive, and the date scrawled underneath was just 3 months old. Daniel felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. The Phantom wasn't done. Sarah was still out there. And if Ethan's stories were true, there could be more. Children who had been missing for decades, hidden away in some dark corner of the world. He turned to his team, his voice low but firm. "This ends now. We're not waiting for him to take another kid. We find him. We bring them all home." But even as he said the words, a chill crawled up his spine. Because deep down, Daniel knew the Phantom was already watching, waiting, smiling. And somewhere in Oak Ridge, under the cover of darkness, He was getting ready for his next move. The story exploded. Overnight, Oak Ridge went from a sleepy, haunted town to the epicenter of a national frenzy. Every news outlet ran Ethan Miller's face on repeat, a side-by-side comparison of his 1995 school photo with a fresh image from the hospital. The shock wasn't just that he had been found alive after 2 decades, it was that he hadn't aged. His frame was fragile, skin stretched over narrow bones. His hair was the same sandy brown it had been in his childhood portraits, his freckles in the exact same places. There were no signs of puberty, no growth spurts, no scars that came with time. Ethan was still 10 years old. The media called it a miracle. Headlines screamed, "Boy lost for 20 years returns unchanged," and the Oak Ridge Phantom's immortal victim. Theories swirled online. Was it a medical anomaly? Some kind of coma? Or something stranger? But to Detective Daniel Carter, it wasn't miraculous. It was unnerving. The official narrative painted Harold Crowley as the monster behind it all. A recluse, a loner, a local who'd quietly disappeared from town records shortly after Ethan's abduction. His fingerprints were everywhere in the crumbling house. His name matched the deed. His bank account had been inactive for years, and his body was found in the basement. Daniel remembered the moment clearly. Crowley slumped in the shadows, head tilted back, his throat slit. His lips had been carved into a grotesque smile, stitched crudely into place. Blood had pooled beneath him, dried in thick, black streaks. The medical examiner labeled it a suicide. Guilt, some speculated. The weight of his crimes caught up with him. But Daniel didn't buy it. The way Crowley's body was positioned felt staged. And that smile, it wasn't just disturbing. It felt like a message. Daniel spent hours reviewing Ethan's medical reports. Malnourished, dehydrated, riddled with vitamin deficiencies, but otherwise healthy, stable, perfectly preserved, like time had stopped for him in 1995. And then there was his demeanor. Ethan wasn't like Lila. The girl clung to her mother, cried through the night, and jumped at every sound. But Ethan, he was quiet, still, watchful. He didn't ask for toys or food or his parents. He didn't ask what year it was. He didn't cry when doctors poked and prodded him. He just sat, observing, like he'd been waiting for this. It was 2:47 a.m. when Daniel found himself standing outside Ethan's hospital room. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the fact that Oak Ridge felt wrong, like the town was holding its breath. He pushed open the door quietly. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a monitor. Ethan was sitting upright in bed, his knees drawn up, his eyes open and fixed on the door. "Hi, Ethan," Daniel said softly. The boy tilted his head slightly. "Hello, detective." Daniel froze. Ethan's voice wasn't shaky or weak like Lila's. It was steady, calm, measured. "I couldn't sleep," Daniel said, stepping closer. Ethan's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Neither could I." Daniel pulled up a chair. "You're safe now, you know. No one's going to hurt you." "I know," Ethan replied. There was a long pause. "Thank you for bringing me home," the boy said suddenly, his voice almost a whisper. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "I've missed you." The words echoed in his head. He'd seen them before, in the letters. And then, softly, Ethan asked, "Do you remember me?" The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He glanced instinctively at the window. It was shut tight, but the room felt colder than the hallway outside. A shiver ran down his arms. "Of course I remember you," Daniel said carefully. "Everyone does." Ethan tilted his head again, eyes glinting in the dim light. "No, not like that." "What do you mean?" Ethan didn't answer. He just stared, his gaze unblinking, his expression unnervingly calm. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his chest, like the weight of being watched. "Ethan," he said softly, "can you tell me what happened? Who took you?" Ethan's smile widened slightly. "He took care of me." Daniel leaned forward. "Harold Crowley?" The boy giggled, a sound that didn't match his blank expression. "No," Ethan whispered. "Not Harold." Daniel felt his skin prickle. "Then who?" Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. "The man who lives in the house." "Crowley's house." "No." Ethan's eyes darted to the window again. "The house that's everywhere." Daniel blinked. "I don't understand." The boy leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "You will." Daniel swallowed hard. "Where's Sarah Whitman, Ethan? Do you know where she is?" Ethan tilted his head, studying him. "She's with him now? Like I was." "Who is he, Ethan?" The boy's expression darkened. his voice so soft Daniel had to lean in to hear. "You know him," Ethan whispered. The next morning, Daniel met with the hospital security team. He'd requested footage from Ethan's room overnight, a gut feeling gnawing at him after their conversation. He watched the black and white video closely, scanning for anything unusual. At 2:47 a.m., Daniel appeared on screen, entering the room. He saw himself sit down, talk to Ethan, lean in to listen. But Ethan wasn't moving. Not a blink, not a twitch, just sitting perfectly still, staring at Daniel the entire time. Even when Daniel spoke, even when Daniel leaned in close, Daniel frowned. The footage had no sound, but the conversation replayed vividly in his head. The words Ethan had spoken, but on screen, his lips never moved. Ethan's parents were brought to the hospital under heavy security. Anna Miller collapsed when she saw him, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her son to her chest. Mark stood behind her, stunned, his hands shaking. "My baby," Anna whispered over and over. "My baby." Ethan hugged her back, but his expression never changed. He didn't cry, didn't smile, just rested his chin on her shoulder and stared over her shoulder at Daniel. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't looking at him. He was looking through him. The forensics team discovered a locked box in Crowley's basement hidden behind a wall panel. Inside were stacks of Polaroids, a few cassette tapes, and a journal. The journal was filled with rambling entries about the house, the boy, and the man with no face. Crowley wrote about voices in the walls, shadows that moved. He wrote about a presence that promised him a family and kept the children perfect. One entry stood out. "The boy never ages. He smiles in his sleep. Sometimes I hear him whispering in my dreams. He says he remembers me. He says he remembers them all." Daniel slammed the journal shut while rising in his throat. That night, a nurse approached Daniel with a pale face. "Detective Carter," she said nervously. I thought you should know something." "What is it?" She glanced around before leaning in. "The boy, Ethan, he doesn't sleep." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "We've been watching him. Every time we check on him, he's awake. Just sitting there, staring. Even when we dim the lights. Even when we think he's asleep, his eyes are open." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Last night," the nurse whispered, "he was humming this strange little tune. I asked him what it was, and he said it was the song you used to whistle on the playground." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "I haven't whistled that song in years." The nurse nodded, her hands trembling. "He said you still do. At night." That evening, Daniel went home, exhausted. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. He hadn't whistled that tune since he was a kid. It was something he and Ethan had made up, a silly melody they'd sing while riding bikes. At some point, he drifted into a fitful sleep. In his dream, he was back in Oak Ridge Elementary's playground. It was dusk. The swings creaked in the wind. He was 10 years old again, standing barefoot in the sand. And Ethan was there, but not 10-year-old Ethan. Adult Ethan, a man with the same pale face, the same hollow eyes. He stood on the edge of the playground, motionless, his head tilted. "Do you remember me?" he whispered. Daniel tried to move, but his feet were stuck in the sand. Ethan stepped closer, his face stretching into a grotesque smile. Behind him, a shadow loomed, a figure so tall it seemed to blot out the fading sun. Its limbs were impossibly long, its face a featureless void. The shadow knelt behind Ethan, placing its hands on the boy's shoulders. And then it spoke, in Daniel's own voice. "Thank you for bringing him home." Daniel woke with a start, sweat soaking his shirt. The room was dark. The clock read 3:33 a.m. A soft sound caught his attention, a faint rustling outside his front door. Heart pounding, he grabbed his gun and crept toward the entrance. When he opened the door, the street was empty. But there, on his welcome mat, was a single Polaroid. It was a picture of Daniel, as a child, standing in the same playground from his dream. Underneath, in red ink, were 4 words. "Do you remember me?" The more Daniel dug, the less the world felt real. Evidence contradicted itself. Witnesses swore they'd seen things they couldn't explain. In Crowley's journals, they weren't just the ravings of a madman. They were maps, blueprints, instructions. Every page dripped with obsession. Crowley had drawn hundreds of crude sketches of a single figure, impossibly tall, thin as bone, and smiling. Always smiling. Sometimes it wore a child's face. Sometimes it was just a shadow. And always, it stood beneath a single flickering street lamp. In the journal's margins, Crowley had scrawled words that made Daniel's skin crawl. The gift of forever childhood is a mercy, a promise. No growing pains, no dying. Just innocence, perfectly preserved. There were lists of names, children who'd gone missing across decades, maybe centuries. He traced them with shaking fingers, his own childhood friends among them. Some of the dates predated the founding of Oak Ridge itself, and scattered between the names were strange phrases like whispers. The house is always here. It hides beneath the lamp. The boy is the doorway. Daniel's gut told him Crowley hadn't acted alone. That house, those Polaroids, Crowley's death, it all felt orchestrated, like someone or something had carefully arranged every piece. And so, on a cold October night, Daniel grabbed his flashlight, gun, and Crowley's journal and drove to the old road where it all began. The lamp was still flickering, that same harsh yellow glow, the same one Ethan's bike had lain beneath 20 years ago, the same one Lila Jennings had vanished under. Daniel crouched down, scanning the dirt, and that's when he saw it, a faint outline of metal buried beneath the soil, like the edge of a trapdoor. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he dug with his hands, scraping away leaves, gravel, and years of dust. He unearthed a rusted metal hatch, the kind used for storm shelters, its hinges corroded but intact. With a deep breath, he heaved it open. A damp, musty smell rose from the darkness below. He shined his flashlight down and saw a narrow stairwell spiraling into the earth. Against every instinct screaming at him to turn back, Daniel descended. The stairwell led to a network of tunnels carved out of stone and dirt. They were old, older than Oak Ridge itself, older than the country. The walls were lined with crude drawings, stick figures with hollow faces, children holding hands with towering shapes. Candles flickered in alcoves, their wax pooled and hardened in layers that suggested years of use. Daniel's footsteps echoed through the labyrinth as he followed the faint hum of voices deeper and deeper. The tunnels opened into a massive underground chamber. Candles lit every surface, their flames trembling as if disturbed by a breath that wasn't his. Strange symbols covered the floor, drawn in something dark that looked far too much like dried blood. And there, at the center, stood Ethan, barefoot, still in his hospital gown, smiling that same impossible smile. "Ethan," Daniel's voice cracked in the silence. The boy turned slowly, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "Detective," he said softly, "you came. Where's Lila? Where is she?" Daniel demanded, his voice echoing. Ethan tilted his head. "She's home now, just like me." "Ethan, we're going to get you out of here." The boy chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "You still don't understand," Ethan whispered. Daniel raised his flashlight and froze. Because behind Ethan, something was moving. It was massive, wrong. Its outline didn't make sense, shifting in ways his eyes couldn't follow. It towered to the ceiling, its limbs impossibly long and thin, ending in finger-like tendrils that scraped the floor. Its face was nothing but a smooth, pale void, until a smile slowly stretched across it, wide and grotesque. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Ethan stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the stone floor. "Do you remember me?" the boy whispered. Daniel stumbled back, heart pounding. What are you?" Ethan's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with something ancient and inhuman. "I'm home," he said simply. The shape behind him pulsed, as if breathing. Daniel's flashlight flickered. For a split second, the chamber was plunged into darkness. And in that instant, he felt it. A presence. A weight pressing down on his mind, rifling through his memories. Childhood fears he'd buried long ago came rushing back. The fear of that road, that lamp, those woods. He remembered whispers in the dark, dreams that had haunted him as a child. It wasn't coincidence that Ethan had chosen him. It knew him. It had always known him. Daniel fired his gun. The shot echoed through the chamber, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck Ethan square in the chest. The boy stumbled and laughed. "You can't hurt me," Ethan whispered. "This is just a body." Daniel fired again, aiming for the creature. The bullet passed through its shifting form like smoke. The candles flickered violently. The thing's tendrils lashed out, knocking Daniel off his feet. His gun skittered across the floor. As Daniel scrambled to his feet, Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft and hypnotic. "You've always been so close to us," Ethan murmured. "Even as a boy. That's why I chose you." Why he chose you? Daniel backed toward the tunnel entrance, but every step seemed to bring him no closer. The chamber was stretching, warping. He felt trapped in a nightmare. Above, somewhere far away, he heard the faint hum of the street lamp flickering. And then, with a soft pop, the sound died. Darkness swallowed the chamber. When Daniel's flashlight flickered back on, Ethan was inches from his face. "Do you remember me?" he whispered again. This time, Daniel did. Because in that moment, every nightmare from his childhood came flooding back. Not dreams, but memories. Standing under that same street lamp as a boy, hearing whispers from the shadows. A smile in the darkness. The thing under the lamp hadn't just been watching him. It had marked him. He'd brought Ethan home because he was supposed to. Because he'd been chosen long ago. Daniel's scream was the last sound in the chamber as the creature's tendrils wrapped around him. In your mind, see it clearly. The street above is empty. Silent. The flickering lamp sputters one last time and dies. For the first time in decades, the road is swallowed in complete darkness. A single whisper drifts up from the tunnels below. "Do you remember me?" The camera pulls back farther, rising high above Oak Ridge. The town looks small, insignificant. The woods stretch for miles, and in their heart, faint lights glow beneath the earth. The screen cuts to black. Silence. Then a faint hum. And finally, the flickering of a single street lamp.